let's have a conversation about the liberal prejudice about prejudice. Because I'm kind of tired of this, and I'm kind of tired of hearing that phobias and bigotries are the worst things that we've ever had and we've ever heard of, and that can be summarized as basically the antithesis of everything that the good civilization does. And I just don't agree with this. This is totally nonsense. And this sort of sprung to my mind after perusing Blue Sky, because for my sins, I have to look at Blue Sky. You don't have to look at Blue Sky. It is exactly as much of a leftist echo chamber as you might imagine. Anywhere else is more fun, frankly. But I have to look at it to make sure I know what the leftists are thinking and saying, and just watching them in their little hot box becoming increasingly more insane. And so I was looking around, and this popped up on my feed on Blue Sky from Otto English. Now, if you don't know who Otto English is, I'm sorry to have violated that innocence of yours. But Otto English is a singular anti-British quote-unquote journalist, quote-unquote author, who writes books about Britain and British history saying that we're bad and all of our heroes are nonsense, and actually we should all just accept that Britain no longer exists, and that's a good thing. And I'm just tired of this attitude and it comes from this intransigent liberalism. So Otto here says transphobia is no more acceptable than any other form of bigotry, and I continue to be absolutely astounded, shocked, and revolted that otherwise liberal people think otherwise. What do they want transgender people to do? Hide away, pretend they don't exist? And then he just says below, just leave people alone, let them live their lives in peace. Well, okay, first things first. This comes from the Supreme Court ruling that actually woman is adult human female, and they haven't taken that well. And so just leave people alone. Yeah, but the problem is we weren't being left alone, right? Transgender people are less than 1% of the population. I walk around all day, every day. I never see one. And so if it wasn't for you guys constantly shoving them in my face and saying trans rights are human rights or trans women are women, I wouldn't even know about transgender people. If I were to look at what I actually see on a daily basis, this is a constituency of humanity I wouldn't even know existed if it wasn't for you. So don't give me this just leave them alone, just leave people alone nonsense, because you have not left me alone. Right? This is what this comes down to. So that's the first point. Second point is the definition of what a woman is finally becoming an adult human female is just normal, right? This is just what every society around the world thought until about an hour ago, when progressive activists woke up and were like, oh, right, yeah, men can become women. So, okay, fine. And if you don't agree, then that's bigotry or prejudice or something along those lines to imply that you have an unthinking, non-rational disagreement with this, that you may not be able to properly rationalize, and therefore you are wrong. Now, this is the root of all liberal concerns, because ultimately what liberalism is trying to do is liberate the consciousness, the will, from the confines of the material realm. And you might go, hang on a second, they're not surely trying to do that. And it's like, yes, no, they are, right? I've spent years now studying liberalism right down to its very DNA, and that's the conclusion I've come away with. They think that actually the material world inhibiting the human consciousness is somehow a form of oppression. That you think it begins with concerns about government, but actually it doesn't. It begins with concerns. It does. It begins initially with concerns about reality, right? It begins initially with concerns through Hobbes about the danger of living outside of the state. That's a terrible and oppressive environment. Your life there would be nasty, brutish, and short. Fair point, actually. I think that if that were to ever happen, Hobbes would be correct, that it would be a brutish environment. And so he was like, well, we just need an absolute monarch. It doesn't matter how tyrannical. And of course, John Locke was like, well, look, if we're the ones making the government, then we can make it how we want. And we can make it non-tyrannical, actually, which, fair point. But then you end up with the question of, okay, well, what should the bonds of society look like? And this is what Jean-Jacques Rousseau comes in and says, well, hang on a second. Isn't the fact that we have obligations to our fellow man oppressive? And everyone's like, well, that's kind of, I guess. And it's like, okay, well, how did we get from the oppression of nature to the oppression of the state, to the oppression of society, if the concept of things existing being oppressive isn't the underlying message that connects them all, which it is. And then you find yourself in sort of modern Rawlsian liberalism where it's like, well, if we had the fantasy of remaking the entire world as from anew, how would we make it to make sure that it's least oppressive to the most number of people? It's like, okay, but we just can't remake reality to make it the least oppressive. Like, would you have a society with slavery if you had a 10% chance of being a slave? Maybe. I think a lot of people would go for that deal, actually, especially if the 90% chance of not being a slave was quite good, you know, a very high quality of life. They'd take the risk. But even then, again, you see where we are. We're in a position where we are fantasizing about a hypothetical consciousness that exists prior to its interaction with reality that theoretically is just imposed upon by reality at all times. Reality is closing in around me. I have to make up a fictional world that I want to try and drive towards, says Rawls. It's like, right, okay, this is all nonsense, right? All of this is nonsense. None of this happened. None of this is possible. And you have taken reality itself as the oppressive factor, and you are trying to insulate your consciousness from reality. And so everything about liberalism is predicated on the idea that the consciousness, the will, ought to be able to choose whatever is happening to it at any given moment, which is why liberal morality is entirely consent-based. You might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, there are a bunch of things in our lives that we don't consent to, actually. You don't consent to the parents that you have, and yet you love your parents and you have duties to them, and they have duties to you. Same with your grandparents, same with your country, same with the place that you live. Like, you didn't choose any of these things, and yet you're saddled with these obligations. And all of a sudden, through a pure consent-based morality, you can see why the liberals are like, okay, well, I don't really like countries. Countries are a form of oppression. Local societies are a form of oppression. The family itself is a form of oppression. And you know, oh, right, okay, I can see why this is going off the rails. And what a prejudice is, if your entire model of reality is I have a disembodied consciousness that is trapped in the material realm, well, what does a consciousness do? A consciousness chooses. It is a will. It decides. It makes decisions. And if I can't rationally make decisions, the means by which it makes its decisions is rational abstract thought. It comes up with premises and it derives conclusions, and then it tries to apply these conclusions to the world, as Rawls has done with his thought experiment, and as they all have, as Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Grotius, however, like they've all come to rational conclusions about how the world, from premises, assumptions about how the world was to how the world ought to be. And so you can see why, if you are purely rational, you think of yourself as a disembodied rational consciousness that ought to be choosing everything that happens to it, you can see why prejudice and bigotry, which I'm just going to call prejudice because they're basically the same thing, you can see why this is the worst thing that could possibly happen to a liberal. Even though, to anyone who's not a liberal, to anyone who's just normal, having a prejudgment about something is how the world works. Obviously we make prejudgments about things, but these prejudgments, which are made through our gut assumptions, these are made through our instincts, through our repeated exposure to things. So we have subconsciously experienced sort of like, you know, what, like, as a man who has dated lots of women, like, what are women like? Well, I have certain prejudgments about what women expect in relationships. They're not rational prejudgments. These are just the constant exposure to having these relationships with women has left me with a bunch of prejudices about what women want and what they don't want. That's not good or bad. That's just my unconscious mind extracting a pattern from reality and saying, right, this seems to be a fairly predictable state of affairs. I'm not saying in every case it's correct. There are definitely edge cases in every subject. But for the most part, for the majority, this prejudgment is broadly accurate. And this is the defense that Edmund Burke makes of the concept of prejudice, saying, look, and that's just my one, as a lone individual, my observations about reality. And that's what Edmund Burke's defense of prejudice is. And look, if you make those cumulative on a society-wide level, you end up with a series of traditions that are built on prejudgments and inherited wisdom that are not derivable from premises. And so they are not rational, right? They are non-rational, they are irrational. And even then, the very notion of saying, well, something's irrational, that must mean it's bad, is the sort of archetypal liberal conceit. Just because something is irrational doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's not derived from premises. Okay, well, fine. A lot of things aren't derived from premises that are totally true, that are totally correct. And so when they say, oh, you have a phobia about this, what they are saying is you have arrived at a conclusion that you did not derive from a series of premises, and that there may be an edge case too that is not correct, as in your conclusion does not encompass absolutely every single possible case of a thing. It's like, no, but I don't have to have a conclusion that does that. I have to have a conclusion that is generally correct. And if I encounter one of those edge cases, well, I'll just change my position on something, right? I'll just account for it as and when I go. That the edge cases don't overthrow the rule. In fact, the exceptions to the rule are what define the rule. This is this, and this is what is not this. Therefore, if this is most of the time, and that not this is not most of the time, the rule is correct. Like this is the problem with liberal ideology entirely, because what they're trying to do is say, look, every statement you make has to be universal, which they don't, and it has to encompass absolutely every potentiality, which it doesn't. And it's a ridiculous standard. Why do I have to do that? And it's because they're like, well, okay, but if the premises are not correct, then the logic isn't correct. And it's like, so what? So what if from an abstract rational position, my chain of logic is not comprehensive and it is not deductive, right? What if it is inductive, mostly, or probability based rather than exactly and categorically based? That's fine. That's totally fine. Almost every decision you make all day is based on a kind of inductive logic. That's not a problem. Most things that we do are not concrete, abstract, and rational. Most things we do are actually based on prejudgments. For example, like when you cross a road and things like this, you don't generally think about it that much. You just have a quick look both ways. Are there any cars? No. But you weren't expecting the car that came speeding down around the corner and has run you over. You don't know. You don't know. You just have to go by what might happen, what is likely to happen, what you think based on your experience and your prejudgment of the situation is going to be the case. It's totally normal. And so when they try to stigmatize bigotry, and again, bigotry itself, sure, it's a negative term, but it's another word for prejudice, having a prejudgment about things and agreeing that your prejudgment is correct, and therefore something is definitionally locked out of being in the category that you are accepting as the general view of things. So, for example, they'll say bigotry against trans people. Well, what does that mean? That means that you have prejudged that a woman is an adult human female, which necessarily locks out men or males who wish to be women, right? Women are adult human females, and therefore anyone who is in the category of male cannot, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, and common sense, be considered a woman. Now, we can have discussions about whether we should be polite and whether there are certain times, are we gonna have a go at Frank for wearing a dress or something? No, okay, I'm pretty liberal in my actual social leanings when it comes to what people do in their private lives and stuff. But when it comes to who should be allowed into women's private spaces, for example, female bathrooms or changing rooms, the males probably shouldn't be in there, right? And this is something that is decided ahead of time, that the people who are being discriminated against don't have a choice over, right? Their consent to this actually is irrelevant. And so you can see why the liberal, who's like, look, all morality is based on consent. If you don't give them the opportunity to consent to something, you are oppressing them. Reality is imposing upon them. It is oppressing them. You can see why the liberals view, why would anyone care about such a marginal issue? The reason is because it undoes all of liberal morality. It says, no, there are some things you just have to accept that prejudice is the right way morally of approaching the subject. And they are desperate to abolish all prejudice because that essentially means if we agree that there is some moral consistency and right in the prejudgment that we've inherited from the wisdom of the ages, then their entirely consent-based morality and rationalistic propositional form of logic is not correct. And this undermines everything about the liberal project. That means all of these high-minded theories that they came up with years and centuries ago, down to the very way that they construct their view of what a person ought and ought not to do, is all wrong. The reason that they're so obsessed with transphobia, again, the most marginal issue you can imagine, is because weirdly, in this, all of liberalism has the potential to come tumbling down. The very notion of their ethics, the way they construct the world around them, their metaphysics, all of it comes tumbling down. And it turns out that actually our minds are a product of our bodies. There are a bunch of things we didn't consent to, and we still have moral obligations based on them. And instead of changing reality to suit the comfort of our minds, actually, we should change our minds to suit the nature of reality. In total inversion in this subject do we find the liberal mind. And so they are, of course, freaking out. It's an itch at the back of the mind. They can't stop talking about it. They can't stop thinking about it. They will never get away from it. This could be the issue that destroys liberalism entirely.